But of course, you did it the other way around, really. I mean, you were an actor first, and then became. How did you become artistic director of the Almeida Theatre?
It was a fluke, really. I mean, I didn't have a particular ambition to run a theatre, but Jonathan Kent, who ran it with me, and I had talked the way friends do about wouldn't it be nice if, you know. But that was usually late at night after a couple of drinks. It wasn't really serious, and but we both knew the Almeida well. We'd worked there. For Pierre Audi, who was the original artistic director and founder of the theatre, and thought it was a great space for acting, for design, for everything, for plays, for music. So when Pierre said that he was going to leave to take up running Dutch opera in Amsterdam, where he now is very successfully, he suggested that I should be involved in the theatre in some way. Maybe I'd like to join the board, he said. No, I didn't really fancy that. And then he said, well, maybe you'd like to apply for my job. And I thought he was joking. And he was for a bit, I think. But then it sort of acquired a kind of seriousness over time as we talked. And so I decided that I would apply, but that I would apply with Jonathan, because I thought if we're going to do it, we have to do it together. I certainly couldn't do it without him. But the job was only really for one person. Understandably, most theatres want one figurehead, not two. And besides, they said there's no money. There's only money for one post. But we found a way, someone was leaving, of doing the job of the person that was leaving between ourselves, so we managed to divide two salaries. And although they weren't happy originally about calling us joint artistic directors, we eventually were when we got a very enlightened chairman called John Tooley. But then we had the business of doing what we wanted, but there was no money to do what we wanted. We wanted to do new plays and old plays, the way you do when you're running a theatre. And we decided we'd design in our heads, hoping it might be a reality, our first season, and go in and present that to the board, knowing that the final question would be, and how do you propose to pay for it? But we thought, well, we'll deal with the art first, and then, you know, at the end, we'll talk about the money. So we said, what happened to be our first season, that we'd do two new plays, one by Howard Barker called Scenes from an Execution, one by David Lamb called Desire, and two old ones, Ibsen's last, When We Dead Waken, and Volpone. But to start it all off, Scenes from an Execution, Howard Barker's play, has a great central role for a woman, and the ideal woman had already played it on the radio, and her name was Glenda Jackson. So I'd also been involved, that's where it gets really, really interesting, and you see how things connect. That play was going to be produced independently by Howard Panter, whose artistic director then was Michael Attenborough. And because Glenda was interested in doing it in the theatre, so she and they had a meeting with Howard, and the question came up, well, to Howard, who would you like to direct it? And he immediately said my name. He hadn't told me, and I hadn't really directed anything. And then he phoned me up and told me that. I said, you what? Glenda Jackson, the West End, you must be mad. And he said, don't you want to do it? I said, well, I'll think about it anyway. I thought about it, I said, well, I'll go in and meet Howard and Michael. Maybe they won't want me to do it with my lack of experience. So we had a nice meeting. Said, of course, we know about your acting, Ian, but we didn't know you directed. And before I knew where I was, I started to sort of invent a directing career for myself. I said, well, I've done a few things, you know, and not, you know, the odd rehearse reading. And they said, well, that sounds fine. It's just, you know, if Glenda thinks it's a good idea, then we will. So why don't we go down and talk to her? So that very afternoon, I got in the cab, went down to meet Glenda for the first time at our house in Greenwich. We got on well, and it looked as if I was going to do that production, but then it fell through. So it was obvious that the first thing I had to do was to phone Glenda and said, if we get this job at the Almeida, will you come and play a Galactea in a production by me? When is it, she said. I said, well, when's going to be difficult? We haven't even got the job. We haven't got. She said, no, I need to know for my diary. So we said, well, it would probably be early 1990. She said, perfect, you're on. I remember those words so well.
And this was, of course, very much you led the way in terms of a middle-scale producing theatre in London, because the Donmar didn't exist then. I mean, it existed as a receiving house, but not as a producing theatre.
That's right. I mean, Sam was about to change all that, but it was just before he took over the place, and I think initially Michael Codron's notion was that this place should be a kind of tryout for shows in the West End that would be too complicated and difficult and expensive to mount straight in. But Sam, being Sam, had a better idea. He thought that that could happen, but it would be a place for doing the kind of plays he wanted to do on a regular basis, much in the same way that we did, although his tastes were different from ours.
And of course, he and you were then sort of major competitors, weren't you?
I suppose we were, yes, we were friendly. Well, you lot were always sort of slightly pitting us against each other. That's the way it goes, that's fine. Healthy for both. Yeah. But we were also unusually new because, as you said, there wasn't that kind of theatre in London, and lots of people had wanted a sort of mid-scale theatre, and there wasn't one, and suddenly there were two.